I never saw it coming. If you had asked me a year ago, I'd have said Emily and I had the kind of marriage people envied. 8 years together, and while it wasn't always perfect, it felt solid. I was the steady one, the guy who made sure the bills got paid and the tires on the car were rotated. Emily was the spark, the kind of person who could walk into a room and light it up with her energy. We complemented each other. Or at least I thought we did. But then, slowly, so slowly I almost didn't notice, it started to change. It was subtle at first, like a faint crack in a windshield that you don't see until sunlight catches it just right. Emily started working late more often, citing deadlines and office chaos. She'd kiss me goodbye in the morning with her usual warmth, but by the time she came home at night, something was different. It wasn't anything dramatic, just a certain stiffness in the way she moved, the way her responses to my questions felt rehearsed. "It's just work," she'd say, brushing it off with a quick smile. "Things are crazy right now." Her phone became her constant companion, buzzing more than usual. She always had an excuse, emails from the boss, group chats with coworkers, reminders about meetings. And I wanted to believe her. I really did. But there were moments, quiet ones, when I'd catch her smiling down at the screen in a way that made my chest tighten. That kind of smile used to be mine. I started noticing other things too. She began dressing differently, trading her usual jeans and flowing tops for sharp, tailored outfits that seemed out of place in our little suburban life. When I asked about it, she shrugged, saying she wanted to freshen up her wardrobe. "You look great," I told her one evening, hoping for more than the distracted thanks. "Babe," I got in return. And then there was the way she spoke. Our light-hearted conversations turned into polite exchanges. She used to tell me everything, her frustrations, her dreams, the weird things that happened during her day. Now, it was like she was narrating someone else's life and I wasn't in it. And Ryan. His name started slipping into conversations more and more, like a stone being dropped into a calm pond. Created ripples I couldn't ignore. "Ryan said the funniest thing today," she'd say over dinner. Or, "Ryan thinks this project is going to drive him crazy." At first, I didn't think much of it. Coworkers bond, I get that. But after weeks of hearing about Ryan's jokes, Ryan's opinions, Ryan's brilliant ideas, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. "Ryan sounds like a busy guy," I said once, trying to keep my tone light. Emily just laughed. "Oh, he's a mess. But he's harmless. Totally harmless." But harmless people don't leave shadows in the room when their name is mentioned. I told myself I was being paranoid, that this was all in my head. After all, Emily and I were fine, weren't we? Sure, we hadn't gone out on a proper date in months. And yes, she seemed more interested in her phone than me, but we'd weathered rough patches before. This was just one of those times, right? Still, I couldn't shake the unease that was settling in my chest. It was like standing on a shoreline, watching the tide pull back further than it should. You know what's coming, but there's no way to stop it. I didn't want to be that husband, the one who pries, who accuses, who makes a big deal out of nothing. But the cracks in our marriage were growing, and I didn't know how to fix them. And then one night I woke up around midnight. The bed was cold on her side, and I found her sitting in the living room, bathed in the blue light of her phone. Her fingers moved quickly over the screen, her face lit with that private smile. I stood there in the doorway, frozen. "Emily?" She jumped, locking the phone and looking at me with wide eyes. "What are you doing up?" "Couldn't sleep," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "What about you?" "Oh, just catching up on some emails," she said, slipping the phone into her lap. I nodded, even though my gut told me there was more. A lot more. As I climbed back into bed, her phone buzzed softly from the nightstand. She didn't check it. I did. The holiday season is supposed to bring people together. But for me, it felt like the beginning of everything falling apart. Emily had been buzzing about her company's Christmas party for weeks, more animated than I'd seen her in a while. She talked about the decorations, the catered food, the band they'd hired, and, of course, about Ryan. It was the first time she explicitly said I'd get to meet him. "You'll finally meet Ryan," she said as we got ready that evening, her tone casual but her eyes brighter than usual. "You'll like him, I think." He's hilarious. I smiled and nodded, hiding the knot tightening in my stomach. Meeting Ryan wasn't on my holiday wish list, but I wasn't about to show my hand. Not yet. The party was held at a swanky downtown hotel, the kind of place with twinkling lights wrapped around every column and a giant, glittering tree in the center of the ballroom. Emily looked stunning in a dark green dress that hugged her figure, a sight that reminded me why I fell in love with her in the first place. For a moment, I forgot my unease, until Ryan appeared. She spotted him across the room, waving him over with an enthusiasm that twisted something inside me. Ryan, come meet Alex. Ryan was exactly what I expected and everything I didn't want him to be. Tall, confident, and effortlessly charming. He carried himself with an ease that made it impossible not to notice him. His handshake was firm, his smile wide, but there was something in the way his eyes lingered on Emily that set my teeth on edge. "So, you're the husband," Ryan said, his voice smooth. "That's me," I replied, forcing a polite smile. Emily laughed, her hand brushing his arm as she leaned in slightly to say something I didn't catch. They were close, closer than colleagues should be, and the sight of it turned my stomach. Throughout the evening, Ryan seemed to orbit around her. Whether it was during group conversations or while grabbing drinks at the bar, he always found a way to position himself near Emily. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things, that it was just harmless coworker camaraderie, but the pit in my stomach told me otherwise. On the drive home, I couldn't keep quiet. "Ryan's quite the character," I said, keeping my tone neutral. Emily glanced at me, her face unreadable in the glow of passing streetlights. "He's great, isn't he? Everyone loves him. Seems like he's around you a lot," I said carefully. She shrugged. "We work closely together. That's all." Her answer should have reassured me, but it didn't. Not when I noticed how quickly she changed the subject, steering the conversation toward the food and the decorations instead. In the weeks that followed, Ryan became a fixture in our lives, even if he wasn't physically present. Emily mentioned him constantly, stories about his jokes, his work ethic, even how he handled a tricky client situation. I tried to brush it off, telling myself she was just venting about work, but her words carried an undercurrent that felt too personal. And then there were the late nights. "Team dinner," she'd text, often after I'd already set the table for two. Or, "Running late. Don't wait up." I'd reply with something supportive, "No problem, have fun." But every time, I'd feel a pang of something I didn't want to name. It was like she was slipping further away, and I didn't know how to stop it. One evening, after another team dinner text, I gave in to the gnawing doubt that had been eating away at me for weeks. Emily's phone was on the counter, her lock screen lighting up with a notification. "Ryan, you always make these boring dinners bearable." Smiling face with smiling. My chest tightened as I unlocked her phone. I didn't want to invade her privacy, but the part of me desperate for answers overruled everything else. I opened their chat, scrolling through the messages with shaky hands. It wasn't explicit, but it was enough. Flirty jokes, inside references, and little emojis that felt like daggers. "Looking forward to tomorrow," one message read. "You're hilarious," another said, paired with a laughing emoji. I set the phone down, my heart pounding. It wasn't enough to accuse her of anything, but it was too much to ignore. I told myself I could be reading into it, that this was just how co-workers joked around. But deep down, I knew better. I didn't confront her, not yet. I wasn't sure if I was ready to hear the answers to the questions swirling in my head. Instead, I started watching more closely. And then, Ryan showed up at our house. It was a Wednesday evening, and Emily was in the shower when the doorbell rang. I opened the door to find Ryan standing there, holding a manila folder. "Hey, Alex," he said casually, as if this was normal. "I just needed to drop this off for Emily. It's for the meeting tomorrow." I stared at him, my hand gripping the doorframe. He was dressed down in jeans and a jacket, his hair slightly tousled, like he'd just come from somewhere casual. Felt too personal, too comfortable. "Sure," I said, forcing a smile. "I'll make sure she gets it." "Thanks," he said, handing me the folder. "Tell her I said hi." He walked away without waiting for a reply, and I closed the door, standing in the entryway for a moment with the folder in my hands. When Emily came downstairs, I handed it to her without a word. She glanced at it, then at me, her expression unreadable. "Ryan dropped this off?" "Yeah," I said, keeping my tone even. She nodded, setting it on the table. "He's always so thorough." I didn't reply. That night, as Emily slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. The cracks in our marriage were no longer subtle. They were deep, jagged lines, and I was standing on the edge of a collapse. For the first time, I wasn't just uneasy. I was determined. If there was something to uncover, I was going to find it. The words were stuck in my throat all day. I couldn't focus at work, couldn't eat, couldn't think about anything but the growing weight of what I needed to say. Confronting Emily wasn't something I wanted to do. It was something I had to do. For weeks, I'd been convincing myself to wait, to gather more evidence, to see if I was just imagining things. But the nagging voice in my head wouldn't let me stay quiet anymore. That evening, Emily came home late again. She offered the same apologetic smile, muttering something about a last-minute meeting running over. I nodded like I always did, hiding the storm brewing inside me. As she set her bag on the counter and poured herself a glass of water, I watched her, wondering how we had gotten here. I couldn't wait any longer. "Emily?" I said, my voice steady but low. "We need to talk." She paused mid-sip, her eyes meeting mine. "What's wrong?" I gestured toward the kitchen table, and we sat across from each other, a gulf of silence stretching between us. I didn't want to accuse her outright, so I started carefully, framing my words like they were about us. Not just her and Ryan. "Do you feel like something's off between us?" I asked. Emily frowned, setting her glass down. "What do you mean?" I took a deep breath. "I mean, it feels like there's been a distance between us lately, like we're living two separate lives under the same roof. I don't know, maybe I've been overthinking it, but..." I hesitated, choosing my next words carefully. "Ryan seems to be around a lot. At work, in conversations, even here at the house." Her expression shifted, a flicker of defensiveness flashing across her face. "Ryan's just a coworker, Alex. We work on a lot of projects together, that's all." I nodded slowly, keeping my tone calm. "I get that, but it seems like you two are really close." She crossed her arms, leaning back in her chair. "What are you trying to say?" It was now or never. I leaned forward, meeting her gaze head-on. "I saw the texts, Emily. The ones from Ryan." Her eyes widened for a fraction of a second before she looked away, her jaw tightening. "You went through my phone?" "That's not the point," I said firmly, though guilt tugged at the edges of my conscience. "The point is, I saw the way he talks to you, and the way you talk to him." Emily shook her head, her voice sharp. "Alex, they're just messages. It's nothing. You make these boring dinners bearable?" "That's not nothing, Emily." She froze, and for a moment, I thought she was going to deny it again. But then her shoulders slumped, and the defiance in her eyes softened into something else. "Guilt. It's not what you think," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "I swear, nothing physical has happened. Ryan and we're just friends." "Friends?" I repeated, my voice heavy with skepticism. "Friends don't send each other messages like that. Friends don't show up at each other's houses to drop off files that could have been emailed." She winced, her hands clasping tightly in her lap. "Alex, I didn't mean for this to happen." "Then what did happen?" I asked, my voice cracking despite my efforts to stay composed. "Because from where I'm sitting, it feels like you've let someone else take my place." Her eyes filled with tears, and she looked down at the table, her voice barely a whisper. "I felt invisible for months now, maybe even longer. I don't know when it started, but it's like we're just going through the motions, Alex. You're here, but you're not here. And Ryan..." She paused, wiping at her eyes. "Ryan noticed me. He made me feel seen again." Her words hit me like a physical blow. Invisible? Was that how she saw me? How she saw us? I wanted to yell, to point out all the ways I tried to be a good husband, to remind her of the years we'd spent building this life together. But instead, I sat there, stunned and silent. "So what?" I asked finally, my voice shaking. "You decided the solution was to get closer to Ryan? To text him? To let him be the person you turn to instead of me?" She shook her head desperately. "It wasn't like that. I didn't plan for it to happen. I didn't know how to talk to you, and it felt easier to talk to him." I stood abruptly, pushing my chair back. "Easier? You think this is easier, Emily? Watching you prioritize him over us? Watching you laugh at your phone, while I sit here wondering if we're even in the same marriage anymore?" She started to cry in earnest now, her tears falling freely as she buried her face in her hands. "I'm sorry," she choked out. "I never meant for things to get this bad. I never wanted to hurt you." Her apology felt sincere, but it wasn't enough. "Not yet. Do you even want this marriage anymore?" I asked, the words cutting through the air like a knife. Emily looked up at me, her face streaked with tears. "Yes," she said quickly, her voice breaking. "Of course I do. I love you, Alex. I don't know how we got here." Her words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to take her hand, to tell her we could fix this, to go back to the way things were before. But the trust we'd built over 8 years felt shattered, and I didn't know how to put the pieces back together. "I need time," I said finally, my voice quieter now. "I need time to figure out what I want, what we want. Because right now, I don't know how to move forward." Emily nodded, her tears continuing to fall as she whispered, "I'm so sorry." That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling while Emily slept fitfully beside me. Her apology echoed in my mind, but so did the texts, the distance, the cracks that had grown too wide to ignore. Trust, I realized, is a fragile thing. And once it's broken, no amount of tears or apologies can fix it overnight. I didn't realize how quickly news of our struggles would spread. It wasn't like Emily or I had announced it to anyone. But cracks in a marriage tend to echo louder than anyone expects. Friends noticed my absence at gatherings. Family picked up on my clipped responses, and before long, it seemed like everyone had something to say about my life. My sister Sarah was the first to corner me. "Alex, you can't let her walk all over you," she said, her voice sharp with anger as we sat in her living room. "She made a choice, Alex, and it wasn't you." Her words stung because they felt too close to the truth. Sarah had always been fiercely protective of me, even when we were kids. Now, she was practically vibrating with indignation on my behalf. "She's sorry," I said quietly, more to myself than to her. "Sorry." Sarah threw her hands up. "Sorry doesn't fix this. You've given her everything," and she tossed it aside like it meant nothing. "You deserve better, Alex. Don't let her guilt you into thinking otherwise." I didn't reply. I couldn't because part of me agreed with her. But not everyone saw things the way Sarah did. Emily's sister Megan reached out a few days later, her voice tentative over the phone. "Alex, I know you're angry, and you have every right to be. But Emily, she's devastated. She's not eating, not sleeping. She made a mistake. She knows that, but she loves you." I leaned back against the kitchen counter, pinching the bridge of my nose. "I don't know if love is enough anymore, Megan." She broke my trust. "I get that," Megan said, her voice soft but insistent. "But think about everything you two have built. 8 years, Alex. You can't just throw that away. People mess up. We're all human." I wanted to argue, but Megan's words stirred something in me. 8 years. Memories of vacations, anniversaries, lazy Sunday mornings, and countless little moments that had once felt unbreakable now sat like a weight in my chest. Still, I couldn't ignore what had happened. Noah, my oldest friend, didn't mince words when I confided in him over drinks. "Dude, you need to walk away," he said, swirling his beer in its glass. "This isn't salvageable." She crossed a line, and once that happens, it's impossible to go back. "But what if we can fix it?" I asked, hating how unsure I sounded. Noah leaned forward, his gaze steady. Fixing it means constantly wondering if she'll do it again. Can you live like that? Because I couldn't. On the other hand, Olivia, a mutual friend of ours, had a softer take. Relationships aren't black and white, Alex, she said during a phone call. Sometimes people mess up, but it doesn't mean the love isn't real. If she's willing to do the work, maybe it's worth trying. Opinions swirled around me like a storm, each one pulling me in a different direction. Meanwhile, Emily was fighting her own battles at work. Ryan's charm, it turned out, had an expiration date. Whispers about his behavior started circulating. How he flirted too much, made colleagues uncomfortable, and blurred boundaries with multiple women. Emily didn't tell me directly, but I overheard her on the phone with Megan one night. He's not who I thought he was, she admitted, her voice heavy with regret. I should have seen it sooner. I didn't feel any satisfaction hearing that. If anything, it made the whole situation worse. Ryan's betrayal of her trust mirrored what she had done to me, and it only deepened the distance between us. Through all of it, I found myself looking back on our life together, trying to piece together how we had ended up here. Could I have done more? Paid closer attention? Maybe if I had noticed the cracks earlier, I could have patched them before they grew too wide. But the truth was, it wasn't just about the past. It was about the future and whether we had one. I started focusing on myself for the first time in years. I took long walks in the evenings, something I hadn't done since we first moved into our neighborhood. I reconnected with old hobbies, spending hours in the garage fixing up my dad's old bike, letting the hum of tools drown out my thoughts. Emily tried to bridge the gap, leaving little notes around the house. Apologies scribbled on sticky notes, reminders of good times we'd shared. I read each one but left them where she put them, unsure how to respond. One evening, she came into the living room while I was reading, her hands twisting nervously. Alex, can we talk? I put the book down, watching as she sat across from me. I know I've hurt you, she said, her voice trembling, and I don't expect you to forgive me overnight. But I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make this right. I studied her for a long moment, the sincerity in her eyes warring with the lingering pain in my chest. Emily, I don't even know what right looks like anymore. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she nodded. I just need you to know that I'm not giving up on us. As she left the room, I realized something. I wasn't sure if I was giving up either, but I also wasn't sure if holding on was the right thing to do. Trust, once broken, leaves a scar, and no matter how much you try to heal, it never quite feels the same. The message came late in the evening, a single line that felt heavier than it should have. Can we talk? Just once, to say everything we need to. I stared at the screen for what felt like forever before typing back a simple, okay. We agreed to meet at a quiet cafe across town, far from the places we usually went together. It was neutral ground, somewhere that didn't hold the weight of memories. When I arrived, Emily was already there, sitting at a table near the window. Her hands were clasped around a coffee cup, and she looked tired in a way that went beyond sleepless nights. Thanks for coming, she said as I sat down, her voice soft and uncertain. I nodded but didn't say anything. I wasn't sure I had the words for what I was feeling. She took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around the cup. I owe you the truth. About everything. I gestured for her to go on, and for the next several minutes, she laid it all out. I let myself believe that Ryan, that he cared about me, she said, her voice breaking. I thought he saw me in a way I hadn't felt seen in a long time, and I got caught up in that. She looked down at her coffee, unable to meet my eyes. At first, it felt harmless, just someone to talk to laugh with. But it became something else, something I didn't know how to stop. And I convinced myself it wasn't hurting anyone. Her confession was raw, her words tumbling out as though she'd been rehearsing them for days. I wanted to believe he was this good person who understood me, but he wasn't. Ryan wasn't who I thought he was. He's manipulative, selfish. He doesn't care about anyone but himself. She shook her head, her expression a mix of anger and regret. I should have seen it sooner. I should have seen everything sooner. I finally spoke, my voice calm but firm. But you didn't. And the damage is done, Emily. Her eyes filled with tears, but she nodded, accepting the truth in my words. I don't know how I let it get this far, she said, her voice trembling. I was hurt. I felt invisible, like we were just roommates passing each other by. And I let myself think Ryan was the answer. But he wasn't. He wasn't anything. I leaned back in my chair, the weight of her words settling over me. I understand why you felt that way, Emily. I get it. But your feelings don't justify what you did. You had choices, and you chose him over us. She winced, the truth landing between us like a stone. I don't expect you to forgive me, she said after a long pause. But I need you to know how sorry I am. I never meant to hurt you, Alex. I didn't realize how much I was losing until it was too late. For a moment, we sat in silence, the noise of the cafe fading into the background. I thought about everything we had shared, the love, the laughter, the years we'd spent building a life together. And I thought about how easily it had all unraveled. Do you still want to fix this? I asked finally, my voice barely above a whisper. She hesitated, then nodded. Ido, I'll do whatever it takes to make it right. But I know I might have already lost you. I studied her face, searching for the woman I had fallen in love with 8 years ago. She was still there, somewhere beneath the regret and the mistakes. But the cracks in our relationship were too deep now, too jagged to piece back together. Emily, I said, my voice steady despite the ache in my chest. I've thought about this every day since everything happened, about whether we could fix it, about whether I could move past the betrayal. And I've realized something. I can't. Her breath hitched, and she looked at me with wide, tear-filled eyes. I don't hate you, I continued. I don't even think I can blame you entirely. But I can't live with this. I can't live with the doubt, the broken trust. It would destroy both of us. She nodded slowly, tears spilling down her cheeks. I understand, she whispered. There was no anger between us now, no raised voices or accusations. Just a quiet, shared grief for what we had lost. I'll always care about you, Emily, I said, standing up and placing enough cash on the table to cover my coffee. But this is where we say goodbye. I left before she could respond, stepping out into the cool evening air. My chest felt heavy, but for the first time in months, I also felt a strange sense of peace. As I walked to my car, I realized that this was the closure I hadn't known I needed. I had done everything I could to salvage our marriage, but sometimes, love isn't enough to undo the damage. It was time to let go, not just of Emily, but of the pain and betrayal that had consumed me. It was time to move on. Finalizing the divorce was both painful and liberating. It wasn't the end I'd envisioned for my marriage, but it was the beginning of something I desperately needed, a chance to rebuild. In the weeks that followed, I started therapy. At first, I wasn't sure I belonged there, sitting across from a stranger and spilling my pain onto their clean notepad. But my therapist, Claire, had a calm, steady way of guiding me through the emotional wreckage I hadn't fully confronted. It's okay to feel conflicted, she said during our first session. Grief and relief can coexist. I didn't believe her then, but as the weeks went on, her words started to make sense. I grieved for the life I thought I'd have with Emily, but I also felt relief in knowing I no longer had to carry the weight of her betrayal. Therapy became my safe space, a place where I could untangle the guilt, anger, and sadness that had been knotted inside me for months. I also started running again. It wasn't easy at first. My legs protested every mile, and my lungs burned with the effort. But there was something about the rhythmic pounding of my feet on the pavement that felt grounding. I'd forgotten how much clarity I could find on an open trail. On weekends, I'd drive out of the city to hike, letting the quiet of the woods clear my mind. There was something healing about being surrounded by trees, hearing the crunch of leaves underfoot, and breathing in the crisp air. For the first time in a long time, I felt connected to myself. Reconnecting with friends helped too. Noah was relentless in dragging me out for drinks and trivia nights, insisting that I needed to get back in the game. Though I wasn't ready to even think about dating. Olivia, who had always been the more thoughtful one, invited me to join her and her partner for group hikes, something I reluctantly agreed to one sunny Saturday. That hike turned out to be more important than I realized. I met Sophie at the trailhead. She was tying her hiking boots, her long brown hair pulled into a loose braid and a backpack slung over one shoulder. She introduced herself with a warm smile and a handshake that felt surprisingly firm. "You're Alex, right?" she said, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Olivia's mentioned you. Hopefully good things," I replied, surprised at how easily the words came. "Very good," she said, laughing. There was nothing extraordinary about that first meeting. We chatted here and there during the hike, mostly sticking to group conversations. But Sophie had a way about her. A calm, grounded presence that put me at ease. Over the next few hikes, we started talking more. I learned she was a teacher, passionate about her work but not overly sentimental about it. She had a dry sense of humor that caught me off guard in the best way, and she loved being outdoors as much as I did. One afternoon, after the group had split off to explore different trails, Sophie and I found ourselves walking alone together. "Why did you start hiking?" she asked, glancing at me as we navigated a rocky path. I hesitated, debating how much to share. "I guess I needed a way to clear my head," I said finally. She nodded, not pressing for more. "It does that, doesn't it? Makes everything feel a little smaller." Her words struck a chord. That's exactly what hiking had done for me. It had shrunk the overwhelming mess of my life into something I could manage, one step at a time. Our conversations grew deeper after that. Sophie never pried, but when I mentioned my divorce in passing, she listened without judgment. "That must have been hard," she said simply, her voice soft. "It was," I admitted, "but I think I'm finally starting to move on." "Good," she said, smiling. "You deserve that." There was no rush with Sophie, no pressure to be more than I was ready for. She didn't try to fix me or push me to heal faster. She was just there, offering quiet support and a sense of normalcy I hadn't realized I craved. One evening, after a long day at work, she texted me a photo of a sunset from her backyard. "Thought you'd like this," the message read. It was a small gesture, but it brought a smile to my face. I realized I was smiling more often these days, feeling lighter in ways I hadn't felt in years. Sophie wasn't the reason I started to heal, but she became a part of the process. Spending time with her reminded me that joy and connection were still possible, that trust, though fragile, could be rebuilt. For the first time since my marriage ended, I felt hope, not just for the future, but for myself. My past didn't have to define me. I was more than the pain I'd endured, and I was ready to embrace whatever came next. Step by step, I was rebuilding, and it felt good. If you told me a year ago that I'd find myself here, at peace with the past and hopeful for the future, I wouldn't have believed you. Back then, my days were defined by anger, confusion, and the constant weight of betrayal. But now, as I sat on the porch of my small but comfortable home, sipping coffee while the morning sun painted the horizon in soft golds and pinks, I realized how much had changed. Emily's betrayal no longer consumed me. It was part of my story, yes, but it wasn't the whole story. That chapter was closed. Ryan, the man who had driven a wedge into my marriage, didn't escape unscathed. His overconfidence and manipulative behavior finally caught up to him. Word spread through Emily's former workplace about his inappropriate relationships, and he resigned before HR could officially step in. Emily, to her credit, left the company as well, choosing to start over in a quieter role elsewhere. We hadn't spoken much since the divorce was finalized, but I'd heard through mutual friends that she was focusing on rebuilding her life. I was glad for her, though I no longer felt responsible for what she chose to do. She had made her decisions, and I had made mine. I had Sophie now, and what we shared was unlike anything I'd experienced before. Our relationship was built on something simple but profound: mutual respect. Sophie didn't demand more than I could give, nor did she shrink away when I shared my vulnerabilities. She understood the scars left by my past, but she never treated me like I was broken. One evening, as we sat on a hillside after a long hike, watching the stars come out, she asked, "Do you ever think about what you've been through?" Sometimes, I admitted, leaning back on my elbows. But it feels different now. Less like something that controls me and more like something I learned from. She nodded, her silhouette outlined by the fading light. You've grown a lot, Alex. I hope you see that. I did. For the first time in a long time, I could look back at the man I used to be and feel proud of how far I'd come. The divorce, painful as it was, had forced me to confront parts of myself I'd neglected for years. Therapy helped me process the anger and grief, but it also gave me the tools to rebuild my confidence and rediscover who I was outside of my marriage. I'd reclaimed hobbies that brought me joy, running, hiking, tinkering with projects in my garage. I'd strengthened friendships, reconnected with my family, and learned how to prioritize my own well-being without guilt. Most importantly, I'd learned how to trust again. Sophie was patient with me, letting our relationship grow at its own pace. She didn't push for grand declarations or sweeping gestures. She simply showed up, day after day, with her warmth and quiet support. One afternoon, as we walked through a local farmer's market, hand in hand, she stopped at a booth selling hand-carved wooden signs. She pointed to one that read, "Life isn't about waiting for the storm to pass. It's about learning to dance in the rain." "That's us," she said, smiling at me. I smiled back, realizing how true her words were. Life wasn't about avoiding pain or pretending it didn't exist. It was about learning how to live fully, even when the skies were gray. Looking back, I could see how much I had grown. Emily's betrayal had once felt like the end of everything, but now it was just a lesson. A painful one, yes, but also a reminder of my strength and resilience. The divorce wasn't just the end of my marriage. It was the beginning of something new. It opened the door to possibilities I hadn't dared to imagine. As I sat on my porch that morning, watching the world wake up, I thought about the man I had become. I wasn't defined by the pain I'd endured or the mistakes I'd made. I was defined by what I had built from the ruins. And for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to embrace the future, to love without fear, and to live life on my own terms. The past was a chapter one had closed. The future was a story waiting to be written, and I was holding the pen,